The house was quieter than normal on this sweltering summer afternoon, so I was in the kitchen slicing fruits for a cool salad. I was trying to keep myself busy because my husband was abroad as usual, concerned with work that required more of his time than our family did. I had been accustomed to the long hours and the loneliness that accompanied them, but today felt different for some reason. My 21-year-old stepson, Jason, came into the kitchen out of the blue. He was always laid back and full of youthful energy that seemed to lighten the space. Over the years, I had come to like him and consider him a member of my family, but recently, I noticed small changes in his behavior around me, and it was getting harder to ignore him. "Do you need any help?" he asked in a casual but slightly uncertain voice, and then he looked at me and the fruits I was slicing for a moment too long. I smiled and gave him a knife, and he nodded and moved closer, standing next to me as he awkwardly started slicing. At one point, our hands brushed when I reached for a bowl, and he froze for a moment before quickly pulling back, muttering an apology. "It's fine," I said lightly, pretending not to notice the awkwardness, but inwardly I couldn't shake the growing awareness of him as we worked. I caught him stealing glances at me, his eyes darting away every time I turned toward him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a hesitation, a tension I hadn't felt before. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and it seemed like we were all set. Jason nodded, his face a little flushed as though embarrassed by something he couldn't explain, and he lingered for a moment longer than necessary before muttering something about having to make a phone call and leaving the room. I stood there by myself, staring at the empty doorway, replaying the exchange in my head, telling myself it was nothing more than a fleeting moment. Jason was young, perhaps shy or anxious about something unrelated, but I knew better than to judge his looks even though he hadn't meant to. The accidental touches, and the way his voice had faltered gave me the impression that something had changed between Jason and me that evening while I waited for my husband to come home. Despite its faintness, which seemed like a shadow moving just out of sight, I was unable to ignore it, no matter how hard I tried. Jason began to hang around the house more frequently and offered to help with things he had never been interested in before. At first, I didn't think much of it, but it soon became apparent that his presence wasn't random. The days that followed felt odd, as if an invisible line had been drawn between us, even though neither of us acknowledged it. I was folding laundry in the living room one afternoon when Jason came in. He didn't say much, just sat on the couch and turned on the TV. I continued working, but I could feel his eyes on me, taking glances whenever he thought I wasn't looking. It made me uneasy, even though I tried not to show it. After a while, he said in a casual tone, but his expression was more serious than usual, "Just keeping things in order." I replied, not looking at him, but he didn't respond, and the silence dragged on longer than it should have. Eventually, I looked up, and his eyes locked onto mine. There was something in his expression, perhaps curiosity or something deeper, that left me uneasy. Later that week, I decided to spend some time by the pool in the hopes of clearing my head. I wasn't expecting company, but Jason appeared not long after claiming he needed a break from his studies. He dropped his towel onto a chair and jumped into the water. Without hesitation, I stayed on my lounge chair, pretending to be engrossed in a book, but when he surfaced from the pool, water dripping from his hair and shoulders, I couldn't help but glance up. He caught me looking, and for a brief moment, either of us looked away. "You're not getting in?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes heavy with meaning. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm fine here." He swam closer to the edge, resting his arms on the side of the pool. His gaze lingered on me in a way that felt far too intimate. I felt the heat rise within me, not from the sun but from the tension between us. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone softer. Now I shrugged, trying to deflect. "Just tired, I guess." Jason didn't push further, but the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't buying my answer. After a while, he climbed out of the pool, grabbing his towel and drying off as he walked past me, water droplets falling onto the hot pavement. I felt my heart race in the quiet moments after he left. I sat there replaying everything in my mind. I couldn't deny that something was happening, something I wasn't ready to confront. The way he looked at me, the way he lingered near me, it wasn't innocent anymore, it was deliberate. And the weight of it was impossible to ignore. It was late at night and the house was quiet. I had gone to the kitchen for some water hoping to clear my mind. The air felt heavy, not just from the summer heat, but from the tension that had been building over the past few weeks. I didn't expect to see Jason there, shirtless and leaning against the counter as he rummaged through the fridge. "You're up late," I said, trying to sound casual though my voice betrayed the nervousness I felt. "Couldn't sleep," he replied without looking at me. He closed the fridge and turned around, his eyes meeting mine, something in his expression making my breath catch, a mixture of vulnerability and boldness I hadn't seen before. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was loud, filled with words. I could feel the weight of his stare, because of the way his eyes lingered on me rather than the glass in my palm. Neither of us dared to say. He replied in a tentative tone, "I've been meaning to ask you something." I tried to play it off as nothing, but he hesitated and then took a step closer. "Does it ever feel like you don't belong where you are?" That question caught me off guard, and I looked into his face, not knowing how to respond. He said in a soft voice that "You're meant for something else, more like you're stuck in a life that doesn't really fit you," and I wasn't sure how to react to the honesty in his words, because they mirrored my own feelings. Before I could come up with a response, he moved closer once more till I could feel the warmth of his presence, leaving me shaken from the bottom of my heart. "Jason," I started, but he cut me off. "I know this is wrong," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't stop. I've tried, and I can't." I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "We can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't move, didn't look away. "I think about you all the time. I try not to, but I can't help it. You're all I see." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. I wanted to tell him to stop, to leave, to pretend this conversation never happened, but I couldn't. When he reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against my arm, it felt like fire. I should have pulled away, should have told him this was impossible. Instead, I stood frozen, letting the moment stretch into something it shouldn't have been. Then it happened. His lips touched mine, tentative at first, but quickly deepening. The kiss was electric, overwhelming, and entirely wrong. I pulled back abruptly, tears in my eyes. "This can't happen," I said, my voice breaking. Without waiting for his response, I turned and left the room, leaving him standing there in silence. The next morning was unbearable. The air between us was thick with everything left unsaid. I avoided looking at Jason, focusing instead on mundane tasks, hoping to regain some sense of normalcy, but every time he entered the room, my pulse quickened, and I felt the weight of his presence. At breakfast, he sat across from me, unusually quiet. My husband chattered about work, oblivious to the tension crackling between Jason and me. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the kiss over and over. After my husband left for work, Jason lingered in the living room. I tried to avoid him, but when I walked past, he called out softly, "Can we talk?" I froze. I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation. Forever, I turned and sat down on the side of the couch without saying anything, remaining as far away as I could. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice full of sadness that I shouldn't have. I shook my head and gripped my hands tightly in my lap, not intending to make things more difficult for you. His words cut through me like a knife, and I wanted to tell him to stop and leave me alone, but the sincerity in his voice made it impossible. "This isn't fair," I said at last, my voice trembling. "Not to me, not to you, and definitely not to your father." "Jason, what happened last night? It can't happen again. We crossed the line." "I know," he said quickly, leaning forward. "I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend I don't feel the way I do." He didn't back down when his father was mentioned, but I can't help how I feel about the way he spoke, hardly raising his voice above a whisper. "Don't tell me you don't feel anything, because I know you do." The truth weighed heavy between us, and I was unable to deny it any longer. I had felt something that I couldn't justify or understand, but that didn't make it right. Even though my voice faltered, I firmly stated that we must let go of our feelings. "We can't do this to him, Jason." He looked at me with a mixture of pain and resolve. "I don't want to hurt him," he said, "but I can't pretend this isn't real." Before I could react, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment my husband got home early. Jason and I exchanged a panicked look, and he quickly got up and fled to his room without saying anything more. As I watched him go down the hallway, I felt a pain in my chest that I couldn't describe. The lines had been blurred, the boundaries were broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. My heart was divided between guilt, loyalty, and something I dared not name, and for the first time I wasn't sure what I would do next.